This might just be the greatest Dandan variant since the original Forgetful Fish. I've made quite a lot of Dandan variants at this point on the channel, and I have had a lot of great suggestions from y'all in the community. But one style of deck that I have seen requested more than any other is a Dandan variant based around mill. Austin307 is one of the first ones who suggested a mill-focused variant of Dandan, but the reason I had yet to make one, despite all the requests, is it felt too one-note. Too straightforward and obvious. Another Dandan that has been suggested a couple of times is a Dandan built around Say Its Name and Altanak, the thrice called. In fact, B17 Gamer from the community actually built a list already around these cards, which you can see on the screen now. However, as cool as this list is, it also feels like it's missing something to really push it over the edge. And boy, do I have just the thing. As you probably already have guessed, this video is about if we took both of these deck ideas that a ton of you have already requested and combined them together into one deck. So that's exactly what I have done here with this deck that I am calling Say It Ain't So. But before we jump into the deck itself, I just want to thank you for watching these videos, and if you have any cool Dandan variants or alternative Magic formats that you want to share, feel free to comment them below or join our Discord. You might just see your idea in a future video. Also, if you could just like the video and subscribe to our channel, it'd help us out way more than you think. It's a great way to ensure that we keep making these awesome videos. Alright, on to the wacky deck. So to start things off, there are no special rules with this list. This is something that I want to do with at least every third deck that I make, since a lot of you mentioned that you like the fact that Dandan itself had no special rules outside of having a shared deck. We will still have fun and unique rules for decks, but it's nice every now and then to have one with no extra things to remember. Next thing we need to do is go over some of the cards I named earlier. If this is going to be a mill deck combined with Say Its Name, we need to talk about what these cards do. So first of all, there are 9 copies of Say Its Name, which is a sorcery that for 1 and a green reads, mill 3 cards, then return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. It also has an ability that you can activate from the graveyard that reads, exile this card and 2 other cards named Say Its Name from your graveyard, search your graveyard, hand, and/or library for a card named Altanak, the thrice called, and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. And there are 3 copies of the creature it gets, Altanak, which is a 9/9 legendary creature that costs 5 green. It has trample, and whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. Also, you can pay 1 and a green and discard it from your hand to put a land from your graveyard into play tapped. One thing I want to mention before I dig in here, the draw ability is not optional, and since this is a mill deck, you can kind of see how that will come up later. Anyway, it's pretty clear how these 2 cards work together. Say Its Name can mill more copies of itself, and even if it mills your Altanak, you can still return it to the battlefield if you hit 3 Say Its Name. But now we need to remember the fact that this is also a shared deck. So the 9 copies of Say Its Name give both players a combined 3 chances to play the big creature for free. But there's also danger in milling cards willy-nilly. If you pass the turn with 2 Say Its Name in the graveyard, you are opening the door for your opponent to find the 3rd one easily and get a free Altanak for all your hard work. Of course, that's not where it ends. We mentioned that we were mixing the Say Its Name idea with the idea of a mill-centric Dandan variant, so I think it's about time I showed you the list that we're working with. What I want you to think about as I go over the specific card choices we've made for this deck is the push and pull between the 2 win conditions in the deck. Yes, this deck is built around the concept of dual win conditions. You can either win by attacking and killing your opponents with Altanak, or by milling the deck and making sure that they are the one who draws from an empty deck. Altanak is the only creature in the deck that can attack your opponent and deal damage to them. The rest have Defender. Don't worry, we're gonna get to that. The tension here comes from trying to mill over copies of Say Its Name just enough to ensure that you get an Altanak, but not so much that you accidentally set up your opponent for a free one themselves. All the while, the deck is getting smaller and smaller until the game has suddenly become all about being the last one to draw a card. So, what cards will we be using to mill out this deck of ours? And how can we stop our opponent from killing us super quickly with their Altanak? Well, conveniently, both of these questions can be answered in the same way with a callback to 5 sentences ago. The defender creatures. You see, our deck has a bunch of creatures in it that cannot attack. The main reason this came about, actually, is the text on Say Its Name. You see, Say Its Name allows you to bring back a land or a creature, and if I wanted this card to actually have interesting choices when you cast it, I needed the creature portion of its ability to be relevant. But in adding creatures to the deck, you take away from the idea that players have to use Altanak to win with damage. So my solution was to have all the other creatures be defenders, so they can't encroach on Altanak's territory. And when you know it, there are a bunch of defenders that can mill, ranging from small amounts like Excavated Wall and Rune Sealed Wall, to massive chunks of milling like Coral Colony and Doorkeeper. The defender theme slotted in so well to this deck, with cards like Rado Sentinel milling cards and allowing you to put cards back into the deck, and cards like Wall of Frost locking down opposing Altanaks when they block. Additionally, mana-making defenders like Overgrown Battlement and Axebane Guardian can allow you to hard-cast Altanaks if you draw them in the late game. At this point, the choice of having defenders as a sub-theme was just obvious. Additionally, these defenders get to act as additional life points, since they can block the Altanak but cannot kill him. You might be wondering if there are other cards that mill the deck as well besides just the defender package. And while many of the additional cards in the deck do mill, in addition to their other effects, we actually have refrained from putting almost any cards that strictly mill. And this is because, well, those cards are really boring to play with in a format like this. So we opted to only add cards that mill and serve another purpose. Cards like Tamio, Collector of Tales, Jace Beleren, Founding of the Third Path, Crop Sigil, and Codex Shredder serve as card advantage while also milling. Thought Collapse and Didn't Say Please are both cancels that mill 3 and serve as interaction, and Ipnu Rivulet is a land that also has the ability to mill cards. Also, let's not forget the 9 copies of Say Its Name, milling and retrieving creatures or lands. What these cards allow us to do is make the deck feel like you are just playing Magic, casting spells, progressing a game plan, and interacting, all the while shrinking the deck until the number of cards left in the library becomes an important factor in the game. Some games, the size of the deck won't matter at all, and it'll be all about Altanak. And some games, it'll be all about milling just enough cards that you can force your opponent to draw from an empty deck. Speaking of which, there are a couple of cards that we snuck in with the ability to force another player to draw a card in just those situations where the deck empties and you want to be able to ensure that you are not the one who loses to deck out. These are Jace Beleren's Minus, Blue Sun Zenith, Sublime Epiphany, and Cephalid Colosseum that can force target player to draw cards, allowing you to kill your opponent when you would otherwise be the one who has to draw from the empty deck. But these effects really aren't so simple. Remember when I mentioned Rado Sentinel before? Well, it, Quandrix Command, Commit Memory, and Junk Troller all have the ability to put cards back into the deck at instant speed. This means that if an opponent wants to force you to draw, you can always rely on these cards to keep the library stocked. This is where it is incredibly important to know how many cards a player can mill on board and how many they can put back on board. And it's really good at this point to know if they have any ways to force you to draw cards. Now, I know I'm jumping back and forth a lot, but that's because every card in here has multiple uses that completely change depending on what the focus of the match currently is. A card like Commit to Memory means something completely different if you are staring down the barrel of an Altanak with a shotgun than it does if you're looking at an almost empty deck that also has a shotgun. So let's take a moment and talk about all the interaction in the deck. Set Adrift can allow you to leverage the large graveyard to cheaply put a creature back on top of the library. For example, an Altanak that your opponent doesn't have the mana to cast since they got it for free last turn. But that's not all. Let's say your opponent doesn't even have an Altanak yet, but there are 2 copies of Say Its Name in the graveyard, and you don't have a way to mill more cards to hopefully luck into the 3rd copy. Well, Set Adrift can just exile those 2 copies from the yard with its delve cost. We already mentioned the counter spells, but in addition to the mill 3 cancels, there's also Sublime Epiphany and Tail's End. Epiphany is the do-all catch-all that generates value, counter spells, and even counters the graveyard ability of Say Its Name, whereas Tail's End is more specific as an answer to specific specifically Altanak itself. It can counter the Planeswalkers, but its main ability is to counter the cast of an Altanak or the Say Its Name graveyard trigger. Last thing I want to mention before we go over some gameplay are all the cards that can allow us to draw from the graveyard. Since we're putting so much of the deck into the grave, it's only fair that we can pull our options from that same space. Cards like Aether Helix can both answer an Altanak as well as return a tool from the graveyard. There's also Make-A-Wish, which is a much weaker card, but who doesn't love a little variance to spice things up? There's Classic Regrowth as well to get anything back. Also, Mirari Conjecture and Mnemonic Wall can grab instants and sorceries, and Seasons Past is the big card advantage card that allows you to put every card you could possibly want from your graveyard into your hand. It also puts itself on the bottom of the deck, which I thought was interesting. Just be careful when casting these regrowth-like effects. If your opponent has a Junk Troller in play, you may be in for some pain. There's also a lot more I could go into about this deck, but I feel like we should just jump into some gameplay. And as always, the list is in the description. So in this game, my brother starts us off with a Memorial to Unity on turn 1, and then he passes to me, where I play a Temple of Mystery, which allows me to scry in order to decide whether or not my brother will get to draw the top card. I see a land and decide to put it on the bottom just in case he is currently mana screwed. He proceeds on his turn to do the same and passes, where I play the land that he left me on top, and then end. On his turn, he plays a Desert of the Indomitable and casts a Doorkeeper to get the mill train rolling. I play a Sequestered Stash and cast a Codex Shredder to start some milling of my own. He then plays an Excavated Wall, increasing the number of defenders he has in play. The number of defenders each player has in play is important, as cards like Coral Colony, Doorkeeper, Overgrown Battlement, and Axebane Guardian all scale with the number of defenders. I attempt to do a kickflip with my Sequestered Stash for extra mana, but fail and do a Pop Shove It instead. Since I am low on lands, I cast Regrowth on a forest to make my land drop for next turn, and in my end step, my brother mills 2 cards with his Doorkeeper. Milling like this isn't just to get closer to the end game. Each of us likely has at least one Say Its Name in our hand. Milling like this could unlock an Altanak play if we are lucky, so we are attempting to increase the number of that card in the grave. So far, no luck. He plays another land and passes the turn again. I cast Mnemonic Wall and target an Aether Helix in the grave. In my end step, he then mills 3 cards using his Doorkeeper and Excavated Wall, but still no Say Its Name in the graveyard. However, he does mill over a Commit to Memory, which means there's now an option for any player to shuffle the whole graveyard back in, resetting all of this hard work. I'm starting to get impatient though on my turn, so I break the stalemate and cast the first Say Its Name. I do this because I probably have a second copy in my hand. If the first one plus my Codex Shredder mill over a second copy, I could cast the third and get my own Altanak early in the game. This is a huge risk though, because if I don't mill any, and my brother mills even one in my end step, he likely has the third one in his hand and will be able to use my Say Its Name against me. Thankfully he doesn't, and we continue cautiously milling over the course of the next few turns, trying not to accidentally turn on the other person's Say Its Name, until I use my Sequestered Stash in my brother's end step to mill 5 cards and finally put the second Say Its Name in the grave. However, I said earlier that based on my plays I likely had another Say Its Name in my hand, but I lied. I did not have a third one, and instead I cast the first Say Its Name just to get another land drop, as you're going to want as much mana as you can while playing this deck. In retrospect, I do think that casting that first Say Its Name was a misplay for sure, but as they say, better lucky than good, and I use my Ipnu Rivulet to sacrifice my Desert of the Indomitable and mill the third copy, allowing me to exile all 3 of those copies to bring out an Altanak. Woo, we did it! Unfortunately, he has the answer, and in my instep, he casts Commit, putting the Altanak back into the deck, undoing all of my good fortune, and leaving me down 2 lands, as I had to sacrifice my stash and my desert to mill all those cards. And then, to rub salt in my wound, on his next turn, he casts one of the best cards in the deck, Seasons Past. I went from thinking that I was way ahead and super lucky to being extremely far behind. And just to steal the deal, he follows it up with an Overgrown Battlement. Now, you might not think this is a big deal, but in this deck, it is very important to develop your mana as much as possible. You need to have access to multiple spells and abilities in order to interact with the deck as it shrinks. He already had 3 more lands in play than I did, but now with all his defenders, he also has 5 additional mana from this overgrown battlement. I thankfully had an answer to the battlement in hand, and on my turn I set adrift the overgrown battlement, which would allow me to put it on top of the library and then mill it with my shredder. But on his next turn, he just follows up with an Axebane Guardian. I was fighting for my life over here, but at least I had Thought Collapse in hand to hopefully answer this one too. Which is what I thought, but unfortunately he had another commit to memory that got put back into the deck earlier, which allowed his Axebane Guardian to resolve. Needless to say, I was cooked, and the game played out from there, reflecting that completely. My all-in play of sacrificing my lands in order to get an Altanak backfired horribly. The game ends with my brother milling out the deck and targeting me with Jace Beleriand's second ability to make me draw a card. I meagerly attempt to defend myself by casting a Blue Sun Zenith for 1, targeting him, hoping he has nothing else and that he's going to die to this draw. But I was oblivious and had totally forgotten about the Cephalid Colosseum that he had in play, which its second ability allows him to target me to draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards. And I lose the game right there. All snowballing downhill due to my early game hubris. So over the course of this video, like many of the others, I showed footage of one match while talking about the deck, and then focused on a different match for the play-by-play. With this one, both games ended with milling the deck and figuring out who would be the one to draw from an empty deck, but in the practice games that we played before filming, both of those matches were decided by attacking with Altanaks. Both of these paths we found while playing this deck are equally as likely as the other, and I think that makes this one of the great Dandan variants. I am not joking when I say that I think this list is one of the most interesting and fun Dandan variants of them all. And it's super unique. The parts of it that make it compelling are nothing like what makes the original Dandan compelling. This deck kind of stands on its own, making you solve wholly unique puzzles to anything I have ever experienced in a game of Magic. Please, please, please give it a try. On the surface, it may seem far simpler than it actually is. This deck is deep, with a ton of different routes to victory, and a ton more ways to thwart your opponent's victory. This one deserves the attention. It might not be perfect, but it is so interesting and complex that at this moment, I don't think there are many changes I can suggest. The weakest card in the deck is definitely Make-A-Wish, so if you're looking for a card to replace, I would go with that. And the deck maybe needs some more lands, so you could just replace that card with a couple of extra lands. Or, if you wanted to, you could replace it with the new instant speed regrowth from Tarkir Dragonstorm. But other than that, this deck just needs to be played a lot more by a lot more people. I really want to hear all your suggestions in the comments because this is one of the most exciting decks since, I want to say Nuts and Bolts, I think. Right now, I'd put this in the top 3 Dandans of all time. Obviously, the original Forgetful Fish is the best one in first place, but this one is either second or third depending on your opinions of Nuts and Bolts. And if you have never played Nuts and Bolts, well, go back and watch my original video on the Other Dandans. I believe it is the best deck of the 4 that I created for that video. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I really cannot wait to hear what you think of this one.